We're excited to have Dr. Peter Waldron provide today's lecture. Dr. Waldron is a pediatric hematology oncologist and a medical officer in the Division of Pharmacovigilance in the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology at the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the FDA. He joined the FDA in 2010. Prior to that, he was in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Virginia for 20 years. He received his MD degree from Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia. He completed his pediatric residency training at the Medical College of Virginia, Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, and his hematology training at the University of Washington Fred Hutch Cancer Center in Seattle. We're very excited to have Dr. Waldron give today's presentation.
Welcome and good afternoon to everyone joining us for today's presentation. My name is Peter Waldron. I am a pediatric oncologist and I'm a medical officer in the Division of Pharmacovigilance. I'm excited to present to you an introduction to post-marketing drug safety surveillance. I organized the talk into the following sections. First, I will discuss the FDA and where the Division of Pharmacovigilance fits into the big picture of drug regulation. Next, I'll describe post-marketing surveillance, spontaneous adverse event reports, and the FDA Adverse Event Reporting System, which is frequently shortened to the acronym FAERS. I will then cover case reports and signal detection. In the interest of time, I will skip development of a case series and evaluation of a safety signal. And finally, I will describe communication of safety findings. The FDA's organization consists of the Office of the Commissioner and 4 directorates overseeing the core functions of the agency. These are Foods and Veterinary Medicines, Medical Products and Tobacco, Global Regulatory Operations and Policy, and Operations. The Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, or CDER, is housed under the domain of medical products and tobacco. The talk today will focus on drug safety activities within CDER. CDER should not be confused with CBER, as you can see to the left on the slide. That's the Center for Biologics Evaluation Research, and I will not be discussing CBER, any further. Taking a closer look at CDER, these are 6 of the main offices that perform an essential public health task by making sure that safe and effective drugs are available. With support from the other officers listed on this slide, the Office of New Drugs regulates over-the-counter and prescription drugs, including biological therapeutics. The Office of Generic Drugs oversees generic drugs. CDER covers more than just medicines. For example, fluoride toothpaste, antiperspirants, dandruff shampoos, and sunscreens are all considered drugs. The drug safety activities and surveillance discussed today take place in CDER's Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology, or sometimes known by the acronym OSE. This slide displays the organizational structure of OSE and the main divisions and disciplines that work to fulfill our drug safety missions. In the bottom row, the divisions of pharmacovigilance and epidemiology fall under the office, which is within OSE, the Office of Pharmacovigilance and Epidemiology, naturally the abbreviation OPE. I will discuss that further on the next slide. The other divisions within the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology are medication error prevention and risk management. The FDA frequently uses abbreviations, as you've already gotten the impression. And going forward, rather than say Division of Pharmacovigilance, I will probably use the abbreviation DPV. Looking more closely into the Office of Pharmacovigilance and Epidemiology, DPV and the Division of Epidemiology monitor and evaluate the safety of all marketed drugs and therapeutic biologics, and they recommend regulatory action as appropriate to protect the public health. Our multidisciplinary teams consist of healthcare professionals and epidemiologists with a wide range of expertise who focus on drug safety. You can see from the smaller boxes here that the divisions are organized into teams based on organ systems, or what may be also thought of as disease groups. So what is pharmacovigilance? Well, the World Health Organization defines pharmacovigilance as the science and activities relating to the detection, assessment, understanding, and prevention of adverse effects or any other drug-related problems. Examples of other drug-related problems include a person who receives the wrong dose of a drug, a person who receives a drug by way of the wrong route. For example, somebody who receives medicine into their spinal fluid when it was intended to be given intravenously, obviously the wrong route. Drug interactions, name confusions, including labeling confusions, and evaluation of known risks with regard to the need for risk mitigation strategy beyond that which is included in the safety information. This evaluation of the need for additional risk mitigation strategy goes by the acronym REMS, which stands for Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategy. Pharmacovigilance includes the assessment of a need for such a strategy. Now, this is our first challenge question. The major responsibilities of the Division of Pharmacovigilance include detecting safety signals, evaluating the safety of drugs and therapeutic biologic products, recommending regulatory actions, communicating relevant safety information. And I'm sure all of you are paying attention and can easily determine that the answer to this is all of the above. So why does DPV exist? Well, one answer is provided by this publication that appeared in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2017. The investigators who reported these findings looked at all drugs approved by the FDA between the years 2001 and 2010. They gathered major regulatory safety events that occurred following marketing approval. They defined a major regulatory safety event as a withdrawal of a drug from marketing, addition of a new boxed warning, or an FDA safety communication. As you can see from the slide, almost 1/3 of the 222 new drugs or therapeutic biologics approved during this 10-year period had at least one of these major safety events. This high frequency of post-market safety events highlights the need for continuous monitoring of the safety of novel therapeutics throughout their life cycle. And that is why DPV exists. Who are the members of DPV? DPV is comprised of safety evaluators and medical officers who work together closely to carry out the mission of DPV. The activity of the safety evaluators include reviewing FAERS MedWatch submissions that come in each week, monitoring other data sources such as the published literature, and programs to facilitate data mining of FAERS reports, preparation of reports for pediatric advisory committees, which are required to review all drugs that have an indication, which is to say an approval for use in the pediatric age group. And this is done on a periodic basis. Reports to the Compounding Advisory Committee, responses to citizen petitions, as well as responding to inquiries from congressional members, congressional committees, and the media in general. In addition, safety evaluators prepare written reviews in response to requests from the Office of New Drugs and others. And they evaluate and write reviews of safety signals that they themselves have detected. The safety evaluators also attend meetings convened during the evaluation of new drugs or therapeutic biologics for the purpose of sharing results of FDA analysis of the application prior to their approval for marketing. Medical officers' responsibilities overlap considerably with the safety evaluators, but in addition, they provide a broader clinical expertise in various therapeutic areas, especially dermatology, oncology, neurology, nephrology, cardiology, and others. They also collaborate with the Office of New Drugs on safety evaluations. So what does DPV do in their performance of their duties? Based on the pharmacovigilance definition and our placement within the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology, this slide details the major responsibility of the Division of Pharmacovigilance. The overall goal of the cabinet department in which the FDA resides, the Department of Health and Human Services, is to advance public health. DPV's role in this mission is to evaluate the safety of drug and therapeutic biologic products. We do this by detecting and analyzing safety signals from all available data sources utilizing evidence-based methods. This is done by routine drug safety surveillance and targeted monitoring of identified safety issues in the post-marketing setting, including identification of reporting trends, possible risk factors for adverse events, possible populations at increased risk relative to the general population, and other clinically significant emerging safety issues. We collaborate with other divisions within FDA, including the groups that I've already mentioned, the Division of Epidemiology, Medical Error Prevention, and the Division of Risk Management, depending on the safety issue. We recommend appropriate regulatory action, including labeling changes, risk evaluation mitigation strategies, or REMS, and other means to improve drug safety. Finally, we communicate the relevant safety information through the FDA and the medical literature as appropriate. And now our next challenge question. True or false? Safety data is only collected during the later phases of the clinical development program for a medical product. For those who answered false, you are correct. Safety data collection is not limited to the later phases of the clinical development program. Now I will discuss the science and principles of post-marketing surveillance. Safety data collection is not limited to the later phases of the clinical development program, But before we discuss post-marketing safety surveillance, we need to review pre-marketing safety and safety in the overall life cycle of FDA-regulated drug products. Safety is addressed in all aspects of the product life cycle. Prior to drug approval, safety is evaluated throughout the phase 1 to phase 3 clinical trials in conjunction with the dosage and efficacy evaluations. Following drug approval, safety surveillance continues in the post-marketing setting with a variety of data sources. A critical part of the overall safety evaluation is the entire period. A critical part of the safety evaluation during the entire period of product development and following product approval is the implementation of strategies and actions to minimize the risk of these identified safety concerns. In the next few slides, I will go over some of the differences between pre-marketing and post-marketing safety information. Although pre-marketing clinical trials are the gold standard to determine safety and efficacy at the time of drug approval, there are limitations to clinical trials. First, the size of the patient population studied is limited. Therefore, only adverse events that occur somewhat commonly will be captured. For example, drug-induced liver injury is a serious and possibly life-threatening reaction, but it is typically rare. Thus, for an event which occurs once in every 10,000 patients, clinical trials with even a few thousand patients may be too small to identify this risk. Also, a demographically narrow patient population is often included. Thus, drug interactions or adverse events that are more common among underrepresented members of the population, for example, the elderly, will not be captured in clinical trials. Also, children and pregnant women are rarely included in the initial clinical trials prior to approval. Next, narrow indications are usually the starting point for drug development. That means that patients are excluded who have comorbid conditions. Therefore, the real-world population may look quite different from the clinical trial population. Finally, trials typically have a short duration, and they may not be reflective of a drug's chronic or long-term use. Therefore, the trials may not identify safety concerns that may only occur over that long time. Post-marketing monitoring allows for identification of low-frequency reactions, identifying adverse events in high-risk groups, identifying drug-drug and drug-food interactions. Post-marketing safety may identify a broader spectrum of a reaction that was identified during the clinical trial. And the breadth of that spectrum may include a more severe reaction than was seen in the clinical trial. Finally, post-marketing reporting is a direct line of communication between healthcare professionals and consumers and the FDA. This figure summarizes a broader perspective of constructed clinical groups from randomized clinical trials to case series. And these groups can inform safety issues. It contrasts with the ability to detect rare outcomes, which is directly related to the size of the population under observation. I'm going to start this over, but This figure gives a broader perspective of constructed clinical groups who can inform safety issues. It contrasts the ability to detect rare outcomes, which is directly related to the size of the population under observation, with the confidence in a causal relationship between the drug exposure and the adverse event. An important component of causality assessment is related to the similarity or differences of the comparator group relative to the treated group. Now our next challenge question. Which of the following are types of post-marketing surveillance? Spontaneous or voluntary reporting of adverse events, post-marketing studies, phase 1 clinical trials, or selections A and B? The answer is D, because phase 1 trials are generally performed prior to market approval. Now that we reviewed the advantages of post-marketing monitoring, this list gives you a sense of the range of post-marketing surveillance data sources. First, spontaneous or voluntary reporting of adverse events. Cases worldwide can be submitted to pharmacovigilance databases, such as the FDA MedWatch reporting system. Also, published in scientific literature, publications in scientific literature, for example, case reports and meta-analysis, are sources. However, these are passive surveillance efforts, since the reports are only received, not sought or solicited. Second, post-marketing studies. These studies can be voluntary or they can be required by FDA. Types of studies include observational studies, including those that use automated healthcare databases, or even randomized clinical trials. A different type of surveillance is FDA's Sentinel system, which uses health insurance claims databases to identify, clarify, or strengthen drug-related safety concerns. Above, I described the MedWatch program as a passive surveillance system. As you may guess, there are also active systems. Examples of active systems include the Drug-Induced Liver Injury Network, abbreviated as DILIN, which was developed to identify and enroll cases of drug-induced liver injury. These efforts to develop the network, identify and enroll cases, report and analyze the cases, all represent an active surveillance process. Other active surveillance databases which use developed networks to detect events of interest include the NICE-CADES system, and that's the National Electronic Injury Surveillance System, Cooperative Adverse Event Drug Event Surveillance Project. This is a project of the Centers for Disease Control. And another active surveillance system is the National Poison Data System, to which regional poison centers submit their data. We will now focus on post-market adverse event reporting, a key aspect of post-marketing safety surveillance, and how you, as healthcare providers, can participate in pharmacovigilance. But first, our next challenge question. Which of the following countries does not require practitioners to report adverse events to a national registry? France, Norway, Sweden, the US. The correct answer is D, the US. In the United States, there is no adverse event reporting requirement for practitioners. This slide explains how voluntary adverse event reports are submitted to FDA. Two pathways exist for patient consumers and healthcare professionals to report a suspected adverse event. First, the reports can be submitted directly through FDA's MedWatch program, which encompass approximately 5% of all reports, though this estimate fluctuates every year. These are then referred to as direct reports. Alternatively, reports can be submitted to the product manufacturer, who is then required to submit all such cases to FDA. It is through this route that the vast majority of cases are received into the FDA Adverse Event Reporting System, FAERS. Under the Code of Federal Regulations, 21 CFR 314.80, post-marketing safety reports must be submitted to FDA for the following circumstances. First, expedited reports must be submitted when an event is both serious and unexpected. Adverse experience from all sources, both foreign and domestic, must be submitted as expedited reports. You may encounter the acronym relevant to this of SUSAR, or SUSAR, and that's simply the abbreviation of suspected, unexpected, serious adverse reactions. Expedited reporting means that a manufacturer is required by law to submit those SUSAR cases within 15 days of their receipt of the information. All other reports are required to be submitted on a non-expedited timeline. These include reports that are serious but expected, reports that are non-serious, even though they are unexpected, and reports that are non-serious and expected. These reports, the non-expedited reports, can be reported quarterly, so they do not need to be expedited. They're reported quarterly for the first 3 years and then annually thereafter. Serious adverse events. In this context, serious has a specific meaning. You may also hear the term regulatory serious to indicate that the everyday English word serious is being used with a specific or technical meaning that is different from its everyday meaning. This list of regulatory serious events is defined in the Code of Federal Regulations, and it is legally binding. The regulatory serious adverse events are death, life-threatening adverse experience, inpatient hospitalization, which is either new or prolonged, persistent or significant disability or incapacity, congenital birth defects, and other serious. Now, examples of other serious would include an adverse event such as bronchospasm. In case there's any uncertainty about what a life-threatening adverse experience is, a reasonable example is that of an anaphylactic reaction in which there are systemic signs such as breathing problems or low blood pressure in the context of an allergic event. So that is an anaphylactic reaction that would be considered a life-threatening adverse experience. And now our next challenge question. The incidence of adverse drug events can be determined through spontaneous reporting systems. True or false? Here, it's worth pausing to consider what one needs to know to define an incidence. From what you know about spontaneous reporting, Does it provide those necessary elements? The correct answer here is false. Because spontaneous adverse reporting is voluntary, one does not know the number of exposed persons, and that's the denominator part of the incidence, or the true number who were exposed and developed the adverse event of interest, or the numerator for the incident rate calculation. Therefore, an incidence of that adverse event cannot be determined from spontaneous reporting. Here are some examples of factors that affect spontaneous reporting, both from consumers and healthcare professionals. These include media attention. For example, in 2016, homeopathic teething tablets for infants who are just cutting teeth, and associated anticholinergic adverse events attracted a lot of publicity. Following FDA communications and media coverage, FDA saw increased reporting of these events. Litigation. Many of you have likely seen commercials that advertise law offices trying to contact patients who may have suffered an adverse event. One example recently is the direct-acting oral anticoagulants. The seriousness of the adverse event, the drug product, and the indication also can influence whether and how often an event is reported. There are typically fewer reports for over-the-counter medications, as an example of this. The number of reported adverse events for a drug usually rises during the first few years of marketing, and then typically declines, even if prescribing rates remain steady. The quality of the manufacturer's surveillance system may also impact reporting, as large companies have resources to follow up and engage with persons reporting adverse events, but smaller or newer companies may lack these resources. Finally, regulations affect reporting, particularly in terms of what manufacturers are required to submit to FDA. For example, over-the-counter monograph products did not always have mandatory post-marketing safety reporting. Then, in 2006, the Dietary Supplement and Non-Prescription Drug Consumer Protection Act was signed by then-President George W. Bush to add safety reporting requirements for over-the-counter drug products that are marketed without an approved NDA application. The FDA Adverse Event Reporting System is a computerized database of spontaneous adverse event reports for human, drug, and therapeutic biologic products. It has collected data since 1969, and over 14 million reports are currently stored in FAERS, with 2.2 million reports submitted in the year 2020 alone. Adverse events are coded with special terms called MEDRA, M-E-D-D-R-A, MEDRA terms, to facilitate searching for specific types of adverse events. The term MEDRA is an acronym for the Medical Dictionary for Regulatory Activities. This Medical Dictionary for Regulatory Activities, or MEDRA, is updated yearly since healthcare continues to change. This graph shows the number of adverse event reports on the y-axis entered into FAERS each year since starting in 2010 on the x-axis. Each bar is stratified by report type. Blue and yellow colors represent reports submitted from manufacturers, while at the top of each bar, dark green colors represent reports submitted directly to MedWatch. As you can see, most reports come from the manufacturers, and each year more and more reports are entered into FAIRS. The expedited reports, shown as blue bars, are reports that are both serious and unexpected, as we talked about previously. Something to consider. Remember that adverse event reporting is not required in the US. So should this figure be interpreted to mean that roughly as many expected adverse events occur as serious, unexpected, or expedited reports? Or could there be some bias in reporting of expedited reports relative to the non-expedited reports? Some people might be noticing that in 2015, there was quite a jump from 2014 and wondering what's going on there. Well, at that time, the FAIRS database was updated to include approximately 400,000 non-expedited reports containing data from previous years. This was a database correction, not a true reflection of increased reports for the calendar year 2015. FAIRS is a drug safety surveillance tool with many strengths. It includes all US marketed products and may include foreign products. FAIRS includes all uses, both approved indications and off-label uses. For example, if a drug was only approved for schizophrenia, it may also be used for patients with bipolar disorder or depression. And those events, any adverse events that occur in that population will also be included in FAIRS, whereas a clinical trial that only included schizophrenic patients may see a slightly different profile of adverse events. FAIRS also includes a broader patient population, which includes all age groups for example, children who may receive a drug as well as the elderly, whereas those people may be excluded from the clinical trials prior to approval. It also may include women who are pregnant and patients who have comorbidities who may be excluded from clinical trials. FAIRS does have important limitations though, and these are described on the right side of the slide. FAIRS may capture events which represent worsening of pre-existing disease or a worsening of a comorbidity that happen to occur simultaneous with the initiation of drug. FAIRS in general is not highly capable of distinguishing that event from an adverse drug event. The quality of the FAIRS reports can vary greatly. We'll talk about that further on, but that can be an important limitation of FAIRS cases. It is not possible to estimate the incidence, as we've already talked about, and that is both a numerator or event detection problem, as well as a denominator or exposure population problem. Adverse events that could be manifestations of the disease for which the drug is indicated. Some diseases have a broad variety of manifestations that may not be appreciated initially as being related to the disease, and they may manifest themselves simultaneous with the initiation of the drug. And so those can be difficult in the context of a report on a piece of paper or on a computer screen relative to the assessment of that person who is in front of you as a clinician has available to determine that. FAIRS is ideal though for adverse events that are rare that is, events with a low incidence in the general population, such as acute liver failure, serious skin reactions, such as Stevens-Johnson syndrome, or progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy, often abbreviated as EML. This is an infectious disease that occurs with specific aspects of immune compromise. FAERS is more useful for adverse events that occur shortly after exposure rather than after a long latency, and for identification of events for which clinical trials may have had a blind spot. This blind spot could have been developed because an at-risk patient population was not included, or monitoring for that particular adverse event was not part of the clinical trial protocol, as well as for other reasons for which clinical trials may have blind spots. I discussed where safety information comes from and what constitutes a safety signal. Now, I will discuss how you can report an adverse event to the FDA through the MedWatch program. There are two ways to report to MedWatch: online at the website listed, or the forms can be downloaded from the site, completed, and then mailed or faxed to FDA. The MedWatch program allows for easy and convenient reporting of suspected adverse events to the FDA. When you log into MedWatch to report an adverse event, you'll be walked through an electronic questionnaire. In 2012, FDA released a MedWatch form designed specifically for consumers. The form, called the MedWatch 3500B, is shown on this slide. Although there are multiple questions on the form, 4 questions must be answered in order for the report to be accepted. There must be a patient, a product, an event, and a reporter. Of course, we encourage reporters to include all the pertinent information on these forms and that the previous slides summarized. The consumer form contains the same primary component of the MedWatch as the 3500 form, but it is written at a reading level intended for the general public. Input from consumer advocacy groups and the general public was considered when developing the form. Reporting adverse events for brand versus generic products. Manufacturers of brand name, sometimes referred to as the innovator product, and generic products have identical regulatory obligations to report adverse events. Innovator manufacturers generally submit the vast majority of adverse event reports, even after generic approval. This indicates that familiarity of patients and providers with brand names leads to preferential reporting to innovator manufacturers. This can make determination of adverse events that may be specific to a generic product difficult to sort out from those events that are occurring due to the active ingredient, which is present in all of these forms. The pharmacovigilance of biologic products presents a unique challenge due to naming conventions. This is a relatively recent development because it's only recent that we have had, other than the brand name or innovator versions of biological products. Examples of these include the non-proprietary name of filgrastim, the trade name Neupogen, and now with the availability of biosimilars or generic versions of biological products, there was a need for an additional naming convention, which resulted in the addition of the 4-letter suffix to the active ingredient name. And so we have the biosimilar filgrastim SNDZ and the biosimilar filgrastim AAFI. Now, the hope is that when there are adverse event reports, that the reporters will use the suffix, the 4-letter suffix, to specify the biologic product for which the adverse event is being reported. And now we'll talk about the aspects of a good case report. Pharmacovigilance at CDER depends a great deal on spontaneous reporting. And so going into the details of this is useful. We'll start out with what might be called a straw man. So a healthcare worker reported a male patient started drug X at 5 milligrams daily for type 2 diabetes on February 11th, 2011. On an unknown date, the patient developed liver failure. Additional information was not provided. Now, this is not an exaggerated case. This is a case that is quite common with regard to this level of detail. As you can tell, this case is acceptable because it has the 4 required elements that I mentioned earlier. It has a patient, a drug, an adverse event, and a reporter. But there are details missing. It's missing the temporal relationship between the start of the drug and the adverse event. It's missing any consideration of possible alternative causes, such as comorbidities or concomitant medications, and therefore the ability to have confidence in the relationship between the drug exposure and the event either cannot be evaluated, which would be my preference and interpretation, or some might say that it's possible but undeterminable. So not a high quality case for those reasons. A second case, which might be included as a star case or a best representative case, is described here. 59-year-old male, type 2 diabetes so this is our past medical history part, type 2 diabetes, hyperlipidemia, hypertension, and explicitly no history of liver disease. The patient started drug X on February 11th, 2011. The concomitant or other medications given simultaneously were simvastatin and lisinopril. Also, importantly, these findings of baseline laboratory values are reported on the same date as the start of the drug, and they were normal. The patient, an important negative, no alcohol use, which certainly could confound the valuation of a liver toxicity. And then 8 weeks, so we have a timed onset of the event. 8 weeks after starting drug X, the patient presented to the emergency department with a 5-day history of jaundice, dark urine, and nausea and vomiting. He was admitted to the intensive care unit and was subsequently diagnosed with acute liver failure. Drug X was stopped on admission. Evaluation of viral hepatitis was performed, and that alternative cause for the acute liver failure was eliminated. With no other intervention, and so no alternative treatment that might make it more difficult to determine why the patient got better, the only intervention was stopping the drug. 7 days after stopping, the patient had his lab values returned to normal, and resolution of the acute liver failure. And so these are the features that make this a high quality case that allow the review team to consider the causal relationship between the drug exposure and the event to be likely, or in the official term that we would use, probable. So here's a list of components of a good post-marketing report that allow for adequate case assessment. The description of the event, the suspected and concomitant therapy, patient characteristics, including the demographic features, the baseline medical condition, comorbid conditions, and sometimes of important relevance, family history and other risk factors. The documentation of the diagnosis of the adverse event in question. And this is simply the criteria that would be used for any diagnosis. And so if somebody is considered to, for example, have a myocardial infarction, if you see serum markers of cardiac muscle injury, if you see arteriography showing blockage of coronary arteries, or if you, for example, to switch adverse events, say a patient had thrombocytopenia, and so a platelet count of 10,000 would be an unambiguous support for that claim, that diagnostic claim. So the clinical course and the outcome, what happened to the patient? Did they get better? Did they get better with intervention? Did they get worse? The relevant therapeutic measures and laboratory data. Sometimes this is overwhelming, but hopefully a reporter who is being considerate about the relevant data, that they're not providing extraneous information. De-challenge and re-challenge is a concept that isn't widely known. De-challenge refers to the response to stopping the drug, and re-challenge is sometimes not advised, but is very informative if it occurs. It refers to a patient who had an adverse event. That adverse event has resolved completely, and then subsequently the patient is exposed to the same drug again. These cases, when reported, are highly informative because they provide a situation in which the person who is living their life in two different time points, with a lot of other things being different as our lives are, life goes on, but what is the only common thing that preceded the adverse event is the drug exposure. And so with re-challenge, if the same adverse event occurs, that is highly suggestive of a drug causal relationship to the adverse event. The reporter contact information, we do reach out to reporters for additional information at times. We're less successful. We're successful less frequently than we would like to be with getting responses, but sometimes those are very important and very helpful. And then the miscellaneous. So those are components of a good post-marketing report. The next few slides will define safety signal. FAERS is a large database, and it is often difficult to find safety signals within that database. And so after defining a safety signal, we'll discuss how we can optimally manage these data. Oop, there you go. So, but first, another challenge question. A new safety signal could be a new previously unknown adverse event, a new drug interaction, an adverse change in quantity, severity, or the affected population of a known adverse event, or all of the above? And the correct answer is D, all of the above. So on the left are some possible definitions of a safety signal. And in reality, a safety signal is a hybrid or an aggregate of these definitions. So safety signals are reported information that describe a possible, not proven, possible causal relationship between an adverse event and a drug, and the relationship is previously unknown or incompletely understood. On the right side are examples of signals. These include new adverse events, drug interactions, new at-risk populations, or greater severity about a known event. An example of greater severity is an adverse reaction of transient elevations in serum liver-associated transaminases. An example of a greater severity would be a signal of fulminant or acute and life-threatening hepatic failure. Another example of a safety signal involves the previously marketed drug Raptiva, R-A-P-T-I-V-A. That is the trade name for a drug that was marketed for the active ingredient eculizumab. Eculizumab is a monoclonal antibody directed against a lymphocyte-expressed integra molecule. It was approved for marketing as a treatment for psoriasis. However, early in the course of its marketing, an adverse event of progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy was reported. Now, as we discussed previously, PML is a rare and usually fatal demyelinating disease that causes severe brain dysfunction and frequently is fatal. PML is an opportunistic infection that occurs in immune-compromised patients. In 2008 and 2009, 3 cases of PML were reported to FAERS in patients receiving eculizumab for psoriasis, which is generally not considered and is generally not an immune-compromised state. In February 2009, the FDA issued a public health advisory to notify healthcare professionals of those 3 confirmed and 1 possible report of PML. Then in April 2009, the manufacturer, Genentech, withdrew Raptiva from the market, consistent with FDA's recommendation. What is a safety signal? A safety signal has been defined in many ways by different groups and in varying contexts. The Council for International Organizations of Medical Sciences, which in the US is abbreviated as SIAMS, but since it's international, I don't know how other people pronounce that. This organization defines a safety signal as information that arises from one or multiple sources, including observations and experiments, which suggest a new, potentially causal association or a new aspect of a known association between an intervention and an event or set of related events, either adverse or beneficial. Well, the beneficial part is curious, but keep that in mind. It's unexpected. That's the key component. In general, safety signals are reported information that describe a possible causal relationship between an adverse event and a drug, and the relationship is previously unknown or incompletely understood. This is a slightly brief and I would call a distilled version of the SIAMS version. So pharmacovigilance may include review of many different sources of safety signals. We've already talked about FAIRS, data mining databases is another potential source of safety signals. The medical literature, as well as periodic adverse experience reports that we talked about earlier. Manufacturers are required to submit quarterly during the first 3 years of a drug's life, and then yearly thereafter. Other sources of safety signals may include study results from clinical trials, epidemiologic studies, registries, even the media. The manufacturer's global safety database is a source that sometimes is produced spontaneously, sometimes through inquiry from DPV and the FDA. Occasionally, inquiries come from citizens' petitions, and also the international regulatory agencies may identify a safety signal that we have missed and certainly, or had not seen or had not considered. And certainly that happens going the other way as well. They are a signal source at times. The list of the possible sources, of course, continues to expand as new resources, tools, and data streams become available. So next, we'll examine some of the sources of safety signals that we use on a routine basis. And this is goes under the term of data mining. A principal tool of data mining is looking at disproportionality. This is an important tool in FAIRS because FAIRS is one of adverse events. And in order to separate out the adverse event for a particular signal in question from the ocean of adverse events that exist in FAIRS, we need tools to do that. The data mining method of disproportionality helps us to identify trends in reporting and new safety signals. Data mining is a mathematical tool that identifies higher than expected reporting frequency of product or drug event combinations. And this is reflected in various statistical scores, including the most common score that we use, which is called the EB05. This score indicates when the value for the EB05 is greater than or equal to 2, a 95% confidence that a drug event combination appears at least twice, at least 2 times, the expected rate when considering all other drugs and all drug events in the database. Data mining aids in finding reports and events that are out of the ordinary or disproportional. Data mining is intended to be hypothesis generating and can prompt a review and may supplement the comprehensive review in FAIRS. It does not confirm causality or replace the clinical review of case reports. The final step in the safety analysis that I described is to communicate these findings. Here are 2 examples of recent drug safety communications from the FDA. However, the drug safety communication is used selectively to announce safety labeling changes. Other means of communicating safety findings are the FDA website, which lists safety labeling changes, Manufacturers may choose to send notices to prescribers. These are referred to as Dear Healthcare Provider letters. And DPV and other Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology divisions frequently publish reports of safety findings in the medical literature. All of these forms of communication are intended to deliver these important safety findings to persons who need to know about them. The previous slide listed Empirica Signaling, a data mining program, which we apply to the FAERS database as one of possible sources for safety signals. This data mining method helps us to identify trends in reporting and new safety signals. Data mining is a mathematical tool that identifies higher than expected reporting frequency of product event combinations. And this is reflected in various statistical scores, including EB05. A EB05 score of greater than or equal to 2 indicates 95% confidence that a drug event combination appears at least twice the expected rate when considering all other drugs and events in the database. Data mining aids in finding reports and events that are out of the ordinary. Data mining is intended to be hypothesis generating and can prompt a review. It may also supplement the comprehensive review of the report in FAERS. It does not confirm causality or replace the clinical review of the case reports. And with that, I thank you for your attention and have a good afternoon.